got into real estate investing in 2018, although my journey with regards to real estate investing goes way, way back. In college, to give you a background of my history, in college, I was one of the lucky people who had grandparents who paid for everything in my college. Went to college, they paid for my housing, they paid for my my costs for food, books, tuition, all the above. And after a few years, I was living in a single apartment, and I had this inkling that I could be doing something with real estate here, given the demand for housing and students in particular, and the prices they were paying. So I talked to my grandparents, and I was thinking along the lines of, is there any possible way that you could buy a property for me, in terms of, they would buy the property, I would pay them instead of paying the rent. And then upon graduation, I would buy them out of the property essentially and use it as a rental property. It was something that was forming in the back of my mind. I really couldn't put a lot of good words to it, but they didn't think it was a good idea, so it didn't really go anywhere. But it was a few years later when I first started working a W-2 job that I was describing this to some friends, and they were like, "Oh, that kind of sounds like Rich Dad, Poor Dad." And I didn't really know about it at the time, so I read the book, and that helped to clarify a lot of the way I was thinking about real estate when I was actually in college. Fast forward about 30 years, unfortunately. It's always been a part of me. It's always something that I've wanted to do. I just got complacent in a W-2 job and earning a wage. And finally, in 2018, my had enough-ometer spiked enough to the red where I said to myself, I just got to dive in and do this. And I had been listening to podcasts, which I really didn't do back when I was in college. The podcasts, the internet, YouTube, they were all in the foreground, and they provided the education that I needed to really gain the confidence to move forward with this. So in 2018 is when I finally decided I wanted to take the plunge, and I knew enough at the time that I wanted to do it from the start right, which is why I reached out to you and formed a business entity to get this going. So that's when I actually started going into it full force. In the past, it was, and I hate to admit it, it was primarily fear, because before the modern day of the internet, we didn't have all these tools like podcasts and access to easy knowledge and education. What finally got me to move beyond that was essentially the turnkey process and that online education. I could, over the course of my career, I was putting a lot of money into a 401k and then moving jobs. That became an IRA, and I was able to tap into my IRA and actually purchase properties. And what made me comfortable with doing that was the turnkey process, knowing that the selection of the property, the rehabilitation of the property, the handing me over to property management, and the getting a tenant into the property was going to be easy. And it was. Everything went very smoothly, and all I really had to do was just supply the money to do it. That got me over that hump of fear so that I could jump into the market and get skin in the game, essentially. Going forward in the future, I might explore a little bit more about acquiring the properties and doing more of the footwork myself, but it was essentially that turnkey process that got me over that hump of fear to actually dive in. It was easy all around. I knew, having watched YouTube and podcasts, that it would be more expensive later on to start investing and then not have the proper structure in place to do it. So taking notes from podcasts and videos, I actually saw you, well, I should say heard because it was a podcast. I heard you in a podcast, and I had previously been thinking, well, I want to definitely have my properties in an LLC, to have maybe a holding company over those for protection purposes. But when I saw you on the podcast, you were talking about the Ceres LLC, and it sounded to me like a win-win scenario. It's like, well, it sounds not that expensive. It sounds very straightforward. You'd be handling, and your team would be handling all the details for me. So that's when I gave you a call for the first time to move forward with setting up my entity. This was right before purchasing the properties. It went great. I can't remember. I don't think it was you that I talked to. That very, very first phone call and consultation, I think, was just like 15 minutes or so. But the person I talked to was very pleasant. He knew exactly where I was coming from and what I needed. And he got that lined up. And then my next call was with you, and we talked for a good 45 minutes or so. And you just really laid out what needed to happen, what your process was, and what I'd be getting out of it, and just made it all real simple. Well, the fact that I saw you in, or heard you in that podcast, as well as seeing you pop up all over the place in Bigger Pockets, writing articles, I knew that you were an expert in it, and knew that you really had your stuff together with Ceres LLCs, and that whole structure just sounded perfect for real estate investing. So that's when I gave you a call, and I really never considered working with another attorney. Just the availability. Talking with your people is a very simple process. In fact, I just signed up for a year-end review that I'm going to have in another week or two, just to touch base with your team. But the access to you and your people just made it worthwhile. Whenever I had a question, I was able to write in. I usually like a little bit more to converse via email than anything, but there was always a response. If I didn't send it to the right email, it got forwarded to where I needed to, and I always got my questions answered in a timely manner. Well, I'd say that's a definite 10, since I've already recommended you to friends and family, as well as other people on Bigger Pockets. I see you popping up all the time writing articles there, and I still see forum topics where people are asking about legal structures, and I'm actually surprised they haven't seen your post before, so I always try to leave a comment and say, you got to talk to Scott. I am a big fan of just jumping in. You got to pull the trigger at some point. Don't get lost in analysis paralysis. You have to jump into it. With regards to setting up your entity and legal structure, one of the podcasts I heard of, and this is why I communicated with you a lot sooner than later in my investing career, is these people who are now very successful people. They have maybe 10, 20, 30. I think they currently have about 50 properties under the belt. But at the time, they had a whole system. I think they owned their property as sole proprietors or in their own names. And once they decided they wanted to get everything legally protected and arranged in an ironclad protected entity, it was a lot more expensive for them to make all those changes after the fact than having started that way from the beginning, which is why I reached out to you. The costs were low to set up my legal structure, and I wanted that in place as I started to invest in real estate so that I didn't have to pay a lot of money on the back end to get everything fixed properly.